The morning mist clung to the reservoir like a shroud, wrapping around the jogging path where Sarah Martinez had run every day for 3 years. Her footsteps had worn a familiar rhythm into the asphalt, 6:30 a.m. sharp, always the same route through the twisted pathways of Central Park. The other early risers knew her by sight, the young teacher with the bright red headband, and the determined stride that spoke of someone running towards something, not away. She would wave at the elderly man feeding pigeons near Bethesda Fountain, nod to the street vendor setting up his cart, and disappear into the green labyrinth where the city's chaos couldn't reach her. On October 15, 2021, she laced up her running shoes for the last time. Detective Marcus Rodriguez had been walking the same beat for 15 years, but the missing person case of Sarah Martinez haunted him differently than the others. Her father, Miguel, a widowed construction worker from the Bronx, would call the precinct every week, his voice breaking a little more each time. She was going to be a principal someday, he would whisper into the phone, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile hope he carried. The search had lasted months, helicopters circling overhead, divers exploring the murky depths of the reservoir, volunteers combing through every inch of underbrush with trained dogs. But Central Park is vast and secretive, holding its mysteries close to its ancient heart, and Sarah had simply vanished into the morning air like smoke. The case files grew thick with dead ends and false leads, each one a small death for those who loved her. Miguel's faith, once unshakable as the bedrock beneath the city, began to crumble like old concrete. He stopped attending St. Augustine's, where he had been a deacon for 20 years, stopped believing in a God who would let his daughter disappear without a trace. The church felt empty without his booming voice leading the morning prayers, and Father Martinez, no relation, despite the shared name, watched helplessly as grief consumed one of his most devoted parishioners. The community rallied around Miguel, at first, bringing casseroles and promises of prayer. But as months turned to years, the visits became fewer, the phone calls shorter, until he was left alone with his questions and his rage. Sarah's apartment remained untouched, a shrine to interrupted dreams filled with lesson plans she would never teach, and books she would never finish reading. Miguel paid the rent religiously, unable to accept that she wouldn't come home, that her key wouldn't turn in the lock one evening as the sun set over Manhattan. Her running shoes still sat by the door, mud from her last run still caked on the soles, and her coffee mug remained on the kitchen counter where she'd left it that final morning. Detective Rodriguez would visit Miguel sometimes, not officially, but as one broken man checking on another, both of them carrying the weight of unanswered questions and the terrible certainty that somewhere in the city they loved, a young woman had been swallowed by darkness. The seasons changed around Central Park, autumn leaves falling like tears onto the paths where Sarah had once run, winter snow covering the ground where her footprints had last pressed into the earth. Spring returned with cruel optimism, bringing new life to the trees that had witnessed her disappearance, and summer blazed overhead with indifferent heat. 2 years passed in this cycle of searching and hoping and slowly dying inside, until Detective Rodriguez found himself standing by the lake on a gray October morning, watching something small and delicate floating on the surface like a message from the dead. The water lapped gently against the shore, and in that moment he knew that Sarah Martinez was about to speak from beyond the silence. The evidence bag crinkled in Detective Rodriguez's trembling hands as he stared at the delicate silver cross, its chain broken, the engraving still visible despite 2 years in the water. Para mi hija querida, con amor eterno, papá. Miguel had mentioned this necklace countless times during their interviews. How he'd given it to Sara for her college, graduation, how she never took it off, how it had been blessed by Father Martinez himself. The forensics team had pulled it from the lake near the boathouse, tangled in algae and weighted down with the accumulated sediment of seasons, but the cross gleamed as if it had been waiting patiently to be found. Rodriguez felt the familiar burn of guilt in his chest. They had searched the water before, but not thoroughly enough, not with the desperation that discovery now demanded. This wasn't just evidence. It was a prayer made manifest, a cry for help that had taken 2 years to surface. Miguel's knees buckled when Rodriguez showed him the necklace, his weathered hands reaching out to touch the cross as if it might burn him. The precinct's sterile fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the lines that grief had carved there. the way his eyes had sunk deeper into his skull over the months of waiting. "She was wearing this when she left," he whispered, his voice hollow as a tomb. "She always wore it when she ran. Said it made her feel like I was running with her." The words hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with the weight of lost faith and flickering hope. Rodriguez watched as Miguel's fingers traced the familiar contours of the cross. And for a moment, the detective saw a glimpse of the man he used to be. Devout, proud, unbroken by the world's cruelty. Father Martinez arrived at the precinct. Within the hour, his black cassock rustling like raven wings as he embraced Miguel with the gentle strength of someone who had held many grieving souls. His eyes, pale blue behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied the necklace with the intensity of a man reading scripture, and something flickered across his features. Recognition, fear, or perhaps just the weight of too many years carrying other people's pain. "I remember blessing this," he murmured, his Irish accent softening the edges of his words. Sarah knelt right there at the altar rail, so young, so full of hope. But there was something else in his voice, a hesitation that made Rodriguez's detective instincts prickle with suspicion. The priest's hands shook slightly as he made the sign of the cross, and the detective found himself wondering what secrets might be hidden beneath that collar of supposed sanctity. The reopened investigation brought the case roaring back to life. But with it came whispers and sideways glances from the other officers who had long since moved on to newer tragedies. Captain Morrison, a gruff woman who had seen too much in her 30 years on the force, assigned Rodriguez a new partner. Detective Lisa Chen, young and eager, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a gentle way of asking the hard questions. Together, they began to map Sarah's final morning, interviewing the familiar faces from the park, the vendors and joggers and dog walkers who had populated her routine. But memories are unreliable things, and 2 years had blurred the edges of truth, leaving them grasping at shadows and half-remembered conversations. Still, they pressed on, driven by the weight of that silver cross, and the knowledge that somewhere in the city, someone was sleeping peacefully, despite the terrible thing they had done. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a homeless man named Tommy who lived in the park's hidden corners, invisible to most, but seeing everything. He approached Rodriguez near the reservoir one evening, his clothes ragged but his eyes sharp with intelligence, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would change everything. "I saw her that morning talking to someone she knew, someone she trusted." The detective's heart began to race as Tommy described a figure in dark clothing, someone who had seemed familiar with Sarah's routine, who had approached her with the confidence of recognition. "She stopped running," Tommy continued, his weathered face creased with the effort of remembering, stopped and smiled like she was seeing an old friend. And in that moment, Rodriguez realized they weren't just looking for a stranger who had taken Sarah. They were looking for someone who had betrayed her trust, someone who had worn the mask of familiarity while harboring the darkest intentions. The storage unit sat like a tomb in the industrial wasteland of Queens, its metal door sealed with the accumulated dust of neglect, and the heavy padlock that had protected Sarah's belongings from the world's prying eyes. Miguel's hands trembled. As he turned the key, the same key that had hung untouched on his kitchen wall for 2 years, waiting for the day when he would finally have the strength to face his daughter's possessions. The fluorescent light flickered to life, illuminating boxes labeled in Sarah's careful handwriting. Teaching materials, college memories, mom's things. Each one a chapter in a story that had been cut short too soon. Detective Rodriguez and Detective Chen stood silently behind him, their presence both comforting and intrusive, as Miguel began the heartbreaking work of archaeological excavation through a life suspended in time. The air in the unit was thick, with the smell of cardboard and mothballs, but underneath it all was something else. The faint scent of Sarah's perfume, still clinging to fabric after all these years. Among the boxes of lesson plans and college textbooks, Chen discovered something that made her pause. A wooden jewelry box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, with a hidden compartment that clicked open at her touch. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic, was a small digital recorder, its red light blinking weakly as if it had been waiting patiently to deliver its message. The device was old, probably from Sarah's college days, but when Chen pressed play, the speakers crackled to life with a voice they all recognized. Sarah's voice, but different somehow, frightened and urgent in a way that made Miguel's face go pale. "If something happens to me, the recording began. "If I disappear or have an accident, you need to know that I've been asking too many questions about the Children's Fund at St. Augustine's." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Rodriguez felt the familiar chill that comes when a case suddenly reveals its true nature, when the shadows begin to take shape and the real investigation can finally begin. The drive to St. Augustine's felt like a journey into the past, the familiar streets of Sarah's neighborhood now taking on sinister significance under the gray October sky. Father Martinez was waiting for them in the rectory, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. His pale hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. When Rodriguez played the recording, the priest's reaction was immediate and telling. A sharp intake of breath, an involuntary step backward, the kind of response that spoke of guilty knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. "Sarah was very curious about our financial practices," he said carefully, his Irish accent more pronounced now, as if stress had pulled him back to his homeland. "She volunteered to help with the children's programs, but sometimes she asked uncomfortable questions." The way he said it, with that particular pause before the word curious, made Chen's detective instincts flare with suspicion. The church's financial records told a story of missing money and creative accounting. Thousands of dollars, supposedly, donated to help underprivileged children that had somehow vanished into the administrative maze of the parish. Sarah, with her teacher's attention to detail and her deep love for the children she worked with, had apparently noticed the discrepancies and begun asking the kind of questions that made powerful people nervous. Father Martinez's explanations became increasingly convoluted as Rodriguez and Chen pressed him for details, his hands shaking as he shuffled through ledgers and receipts that seemed to have been hastily organized for their visit. "She was mistaken," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction, and the sweat on his brow told a different story. Sarah was a good girl, but she didn't understand the complexities of church finances, the way money flows through different accounts, for legitimate purposes. The interview ended with more questions than answers, but as they left the rectory, Rodriguez caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A maintenance shed behind the church, its door hanging slightly ajar, and inside, barely visible in the shadows, something that looked like running shoes. Chen saw it too, her sharp eyes following his gaze, and without a word they both understood that their investigation had just taken a darker turn. The shed was supposed to be locked, according to Father Martinez, used only for storing lawn equipment and Christmas decorations, but the padlock lay broken on the ground, and inside, among the rakes and hedge trimmers, they found evidence that would haunt them both. A red headband, faded but unmistakable, the same one that Miguel had described in his tearful interviews. The fabric was stained with something dark, something that had been there for a long time, and as Rodriguez carefully bagged the evidence, he felt the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The forensics report arrived, on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with the promise of rain, its clinical language barely containing the horror of what the lab had discovered. The stains on Sarah's headband tested positive for human blood, and the DNA analysis confirmed what Rodriguez had feared. It was hers, mixed with traces of something else that made his stomach turn. The blood pattern suggested violence, a struggle, and the presence of chloroform residue painted a picture so dark that even Chen, with her years of experience, had to step outside for air. Miguel sat in the precinct's waiting room, his rosary, beads clicking through his fingers with mechanical precision, his lips moving in prayers that seemed to offer no comfort. When Rodriguez showed him the report, the old man's face crumpled like paper, and for a moment, the detective thought he might collapse entirely under the weight of this terrible confirmation. Father Martinez's second interview took place in a different room, one with no windows and recording equipment that captured every tremor in his voice, every pause that lasted too long. The priest's composure had cracked like old paint, revealing something brittle and desperate underneath, and his hands shook so violently that he could barely hold the cup of water Chen offered him. "She was going to ruin everything," he whispered, his pale eyes darting between the two detectives like a trapped animal. "She was going to destroy the church, destroy my life's work, over a few $1,000s that was being used for God's purposes." The confession tumbled out in fragments, each piece more damning than the last. How Sarah had threatened to go to the police, how she had copies of the financial records, how she had cornered him after morning mass that terrible day. "I only meant to frighten her," he insisted. but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who had told himself the same lie for 2 years. The reconstruction of Sarah's final morning played out like a nightmare in slow motion, each detail more horrifying than the last. She had gone to the church before her run, as she sometimes did, to help prepare for the children's breakfast program. But instead of the usual volunteer work, she had confronted Father Martinez with evidence of his embezzlement. The priest, desperate and cornered, had struck her with a candlestick from the altar, the sacred bronze now forever stained with innocent blood. In his panic, he had used chloroform from the church's first aid supplies, a relic from an earlier era, to subdue her, then carried her unconscious body to the maintenance shed, where she had remained hidden for days. The very thought of Sarah lying there, injured and alone, while the community searched frantically for her, made Rodriguez's hands shake with barely contained rage. "She was still alive when I put her there," Father Martinez sobbed, his face buried in his hands. I thought I could figure out what to do, how to make her understand." The confession continued with the methodical horror of a man unburdening himself of years of guilt, each word a fresh wound in the hearts of those who had loved Sarah. She had died 3 days later, alone in the darkness of the shed, her injuries too severe for her body to survive without proper medical care. Father Martinez had discovered her body during what he claimed was a visit to bring her food and water, but the timing suggested something more sinister, that he had let her die rather than risk exposure by seeking help. "I baptized her when she was a baby," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "I held her in my arms and welcomed her into God's family, and then The words trailed off into sobbing, but Rodriguez had heard enough to understand the full scope of the betrayal. A man of God who had chosen his own comfort over the life of someone he had sworn to protect. The disposal of Sarah's body had been carried out with the careful planning of someone who understood the rhythms of the park, who knew when the maintenance crews worked and where the security cameras couldn't see. Father Martinez had waited until the search teams had moved to other areas, then transported her body to the reservoir under cover of darkness, weighting it down with stones from the church's garden. But time and water had done their work, slowly releasing the evidence of his crime, sending Sarah's necklace floating to the surface like a message from beyond the grave. As Rodriguez listened to the confession, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice was finally within reach, but it came at the cost of shattering the faith of an entire community. The priest who had baptized children and blessed marriages, who had offered comfort to the grieving and hope to the lost, had been hiding a darkness that would forever change how people saw the sacred. The church bells of St. Augustine's tolled, with a different sound now, their bronze voices carrying the weight of betrayal across the neighborhood where Sarah had grown up. Miguel stood in the empty sanctuary, his weathered hands gripping the pew where his daughter had once knelt for communion. And for the first time in 2 years, he wept. Not the bitter tears of abandonment, but the cleansing rain of a man who had finally found the truth he had been seeking. The stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the floor, but even the filtered light seemed dimmer somehow, as if the very building was mourning the loss of its innocence. Detective Rodriguez watched from the doorway, understanding that some grief is too sacred for witnesses, that Miguel needed this moment alone with his memories and his God. The arrest of Father Martinez had sent shockwaves through the community, but for Miguel, it had brought something more precious than justice. It had brought his daughter home. The trial would begin in the spring, but already the media circus had descended on the quiet neighborhood like locusts, their cameras and microphones turning sacred spaces into spectacles of human tragedy. Father Martinez sat in his cell, awaiting judgment, his pale face haunted by the weight of what he had done and the community he had betrayed. The archdiocese had issued statements of cooperation and regret, but their words felt hollow against the magnitude of the loss, and the faithful of St. Augustine's found themselves adrift in a sea of broken trust. Some had already left for other parishes, unable to reconcile their faith with the actions of the man they had trusted with their souls, while others clung more desperately to their beliefs, as if their devotion could somehow cleanse the stain of his crimes. The Children's Fund had been disbanded, the money returned to donors, but the damage to the community's spirit would take much longer to heal. Detective Chen found herself working late into the night, compiling evidence and preparing statements, driven by the same relentless energy that had made her a good cop and a better human being. The case had affected her deeply, not just because of its brutal nature, but because it had shown her how easily trust could be weaponized, how those who claimed to serve God could harbor the darkest intentions. She had seen too much violence in her career, too many lives destroyed by human cruelty. But something about Sarah's story had touched her in a way that would forever change how she approached her work. The young teacher had died pursuing justice for vulnerable children, and Chen felt the weight of that legacy in every report she filed, every interview she conducted. Sarah's voice on that recording had become a constant presence in her mind, a reminder that the fight for truth is never finished, that someone must always be watching, always be asking the uncomfortable questions. The revelation of Sarah's final days had brought closure to some, but for others, it had only deepened the wounds that time had failed to heal. The other volunteers who had worked with her in the children's program struggled with guilt and regret, wondering if they had missed signs of her distress, if they could have somehow prevented the tragedy. The children themselves, now 2 years older, asked questions that had no easy answers about why Father Martinez had hurt Miss Sarah, why sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who cause the most harm. The church's new interim pastor, Father O'Brien, a gentle man in his 60s who had been called in from another parish, worked tirelessly to rebuild the shattered trust. But healing would be a long process, measured not in months, but in years of patient work and careful restoration of faith. As October gave way to November, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached with the weight of both sorrow and resolution. Miguel had returned to the church, not every day, but often enough to feel her presence in the familiar spaces where she had once prayed and served. He had forgiven Father Martinez, not because the priest deserved it, but because carrying hatred had become too heavy a burden for his aging shoulders. The forgiveness hadn't come easily. It had been earned through sleepless nights and countless prayers, through the slow understanding that releasing his anger was the only way to honor his daughter's memory. Rodriguez often found him there in the early morning hours, sitting in the same pew where Sarah had learned to pray, his lips moving, in quiet conversation with the God who had given him strength to endure the unendurable. The detective had learned to respect the mystery of faith, the way it could survive even the worst betrayals, the way it could transform grief into something resembling peace. The sunrise over Central Park painted the reservoir in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in 2 years, Miguel Martinez walked the path his daughter had loved so dearly. His steps were slower now, weighted with age and sorrow. But there was something peaceful in his movements, a man who had finally found the answers he had been seeking in the darkness. Detective Rodriguez walked beside him, no longer bound by the professional distance that had once separated them, but as a friend who had shared the journey from despair to understanding. The water lapped gently against the shore, and somewhere in its depths, Sarah's voice seemed to whisper that her work was finally done, that the truth had set them all free. Miguel paused at the spot where her necklace had been found, pulling from his pocket a small bouquet of white roses, her favorite flowers, and letting them fall onto the water's surface like prayers made visible. The trial of Father Martinez had concluded with a life sentence, but more importantly, it had exposed the systematic failures that had allowed his crimes to continue undetected for so long. The archdiocese had implemented new oversight procedures, financial audits, and background checks. But the real change had come from the community itself. A newfound vigilance, a willingness to ask hard questions, and demand transparency from those in positions of trust. Sarah's legacy lived on in the children she had tried to protect, in the reformed policies that bore her name, and in the volunteers who now carried forward her work with the determination of those who had learned the cost of complacency. This new children's fund, established in her memory, operated under strict oversight and complete transparency, ensuring that the vulnerable would be protected and the trust of the community would never again be so easily betrayed. Detective Chen had requested a transfer to the Special Victims Unit, her experience with Sarah's case having opened her eyes to the particular horrors that predators could inflict on the innocent. She carried with her the lessons learned from the investigation, the importance of listening to victims, the need to look beyond surface appearances, and the understanding that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The recording that Sarah had made, that desperate attempt to ensure her voice would be heard even if she couldn't speak for herself, had become a teaching tool at the police academy, a reminder to young officers that the dead can still testify if someone is willing to listen. Chen's new partner, a veteran detective named Williams, had heard the story countless times, but he never tired of the way Chen told it, with the reverence of someone who had witnessed a resurrection of truth from the depths of deception. Miguel had returned to his role as deacon at St. Augustine's, but he approached his duties with a different understanding now, one tempered by loss and strengthened by survival. His voice once again boomed through the morning prayers, but there was a new depth to his words, a recognition of the darkness that could lurk even in sacred spaces, and a determination to ensure that his daughter's death would not be in vain. He had established a memorial garden behind the church, where Sarah's favorite flowers bloomed in careful rows, and where children from the neighborhood came to play under the watchful eyes of adults who had learned to be truly vigilant. The garden had become a place of healing, where the community could come to remember not just Sarah, but the importance of protecting the innocent and holding the powerful accountable for their actions. The final entry in Detective Rodriguez's case file was brief but powerful. Justice served. Sarah Elena Martinez, beloved daughter, teacher, and advocate for children, has been laid to rest with honor. Her killer has been brought to justice, and her legacy lives on in the reforms and vigilance that her sacrifice has inspired. But the real conclusion to Sarah's story was not written in official reports or newspaper headlines. It was lived every day by those who had been touched by her life and transformed by her death. Miguel's faith had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. The community had learned to balance trust with vigilance, and the children Sarah had died trying to protect were safer because of her sacrifice. On quiet mornings in Central Park, when the mist rises from the reservoir and the city is still sleeping, some say you can still see a figure in a red headband, running the eternal path of those who refuse to be forgotten, watching over the innocent, and whispering reminders that the truth will always find a way to surface, no matter how deep it has been buried. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the story of Sarah Martinez became part of the fabric of the neighborhood, a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration woven together in the complex tapestry of human experience. Miguel grew old gracefully, his hair silver now, but his eyes still bright with the fire of someone who had stared into the abyss and found God waiting on the other side. Detective Rodriguez retired to a small house near the park, where he could walk the same paths that had once been a crime scene, but had now become a memorial to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable bonds between those who seek justice and those who deserve it. And in the Church of St. Augustine's, where a new generation of children learned to pray and serve, Sarah's presence lingered like incense, a reminder that some spirits are too strong to be silenced, and that love, once kindled, burns eternal in the hearts of those who refuse to let it die.